Buenas noches, comunidad. My name is Raquel, and what I'm about to tell you is the most terrifying thing I've ever lived through. It felt as if everything that night conspired to give me the biggest fright I've ever experienced, and I'm certain it'll be worth your time to listen. For 3 years, I worked as the manager on shift at an OXXO here in Santiago, Chile. I prefer not to say which one exactly so I don't plant any ideas or encourage curious people to bother the place. I worked the afternoon and night shift, from around 4 in the afternoon until about 11 at night. From the very first weeks, I sensed that something odd was happening in that store, though I couldn't put my finger on exactly what it was. Sometimes I'd catch shadows out of the corner of my eye or feel drafts of air behind me. Once in a while, I heard whispers from the back of the shop when I knew no customers had come in. When I turned to confront whatever made the noise, there was nothing there. I'm not especially superstitious, but I wasn't going to pretend nothing was happening either. My co-workers on other shifts and the manager apparently hadn't noticed anything strange. I even hinted to a former university classmate to swing by the store, and she didn't sense anything unusual either, which surprised me because she always bragged about being a medium and feeling energies and all that. I felt pretty alone with this paranormal activity, and for a while I thought maybe I was imagining it, since the incidents were so isolated. But one night in November changed everything. The day this happened, the weather was especially gloomy. The atmosphere in Santiago can get pretty dark in the last months of the year, and that day was a perfect example. Black clouds filled the sky so densely that day and night were almost indistinguishable, and a strong, icy wind forced me to put on a scarf and a heavy jacket before leaving home. In general, the mood felt bleak and the streets were empty. When I stepped out, people had stayed inside. And honestly, I would have preferred to do the same rather than go to work. When I arrived at the OXXO, the girl from the previous shift told me business had been very slow, which didn't surprise me. She wished me a good evening and left, and I settled behind the counter with a store that remained totally empty for hours. In the next 4 hours, only 2 customers came in. They moved quickly, bought a few items, and complained about the weather before leaving. Outside, the wind howled and made an eerie whistling that made the hairs on my arms stand up. I tried to focus on the little work I had to do, but honestly, there was so little to keep me busy that by around 6 I was done, watching out the front window, counting cars that passed occasionally, and wishing with all my might for my shift to end. Around 7 in the evening, when outside it was completely dark, a storm broke out. Rain filled the streets, and the only sound was the steady thump of raindrops against the window and a distant sigh that I chose to ignore, telling myself it came from outside the store and not inside. The next hour I had chills and tried to steady myself when thunder rolled in the distance. I truly hate the sound of thunder, until finally, around 8:30 p.m., the lights in the OXXO and all down the street went out. The storm caused a power outage across the entire block, and I found myself in total darkness in that lonely shop. I reached for my phone to turn on the flashlight, and I cannot explain the terror that shot through me when the beam swept the store and the first thing I saw was several silhouettes scattered throughout the OXXO. I'm sure I let out a scream that could have deafened anyone, and I dropped my phone as I bolted to my right toward the bathroom door. I locked myself in and didn't move for what I estimate were 10 or 15 minutes. I cried, not knowing what to do, hearing sighs outside the door. I didn't dare come out until the lights came back on. I peeked through the crack, terrified that someone would be there waiting to attack. But the store was empty and my phone was on the floor face up with the flashlight still on. I don't know how I found the courage to start checking every aisle, the office and the storage room, but I did. I didn't find any person, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, breathing on the back of my neck at every moment. The storm hadn't passed, so I could still hear rain and thunder, and the thought that the power could go out again filled me with panic. I returned to my post behind the register and noticed from there that several street lamps outside still hadn't come back on. I stared, and between the rain and the darkness, I made out a few dark, indistinct figures standing outside. I began to breathe heavily because I didn't know whether someone had slipped into the store or whether they were apparitions. Either way, I raced to the door to secure it so no one could get in. Just as I stepped back, a brief blackout of only a few seconds plunged the OXXO into darkness again, and for a moment I saw them right in front of the store. They disappeared when the lights returned, and I couldn't take it any longer. I called my manager sobbing, trying to explain what was happening, but he didn't understand a single thing I said. He only told me he was on his way. I waited locked in the bathroom, and when he arrived, I ran out to meet him. I had no words to explain what had happened, so I told him someone had tried to rob me. He wasn't entirely convinced, and in the end, I ended up telling him everything. I don't know if he believed me, but at least he let me go home that night. Thank the heavens he didn't have a problem staying there until the end of my shift. The rest of that night I had nightmares about what had happened, and thankfully the next day was my day off because I don't know what I would have done if I had to go back to that OXXO so soon. Most likely I wouldn't have gone, and I would have risked losing my job. On Monday I returned a bit calmer, and my routine went back to normal. I stayed at that job for quite some time, though I never truly felt comfortable for the reasons I mentioned. Still, nothing as intense as that night ever happened again. Continuamos. Hello community and hello Glenn. My name is Tatiana and I'm from Chiapas, from Villa Flores, precisely. I currently work as a data analyst, but 20 years ago, before I entered university, I was an employee at an OXXO in my town. From the moment I started working there until I left around 2005, I could feel that something off was going on in the place, like something didn't quite fit. A mischievous presence rather than an evil one made itself known from time to time. Although nothing especially serious or traumatic ever occurred, I have a collection of small anecdotes I lived through in that store that I'm sure you'll find interesting. The first one happened when I had been working at the OXXO for only 5 days. I worked the night and early morning shift and was usually alone. It was around 2 in the morning, and I was organizing things behind the counter when I heard something fall in an aisle. A bag of potato chips. I turned toward the shelf and went to pick it up, but within seconds it fell again. At that point, I wasn't thinking supernatural. I figured the chips were poorly placed on an old shelf. So I took a minute to straighten everything out because I assumed something was pushing the bag and making it fall. It took about 5 minutes, but I arranged every bag in that section, making sure they were properly set. It looked perfect, but only 2 minutes later, I heard the crash of bags falling to the floor again. This time, 3 bags of chips had toppled, scattered along the aisle. It left me unsettled, and I begrudgingly put them back in place. It was strange, but nothing else happened that night. 3 weeks later, I was serving a customer at the service window around 1 in the morning when I heard the faint, distant sound of a child's giggle. I didn't pay much attention at first, though I noticed the puzzled look on my customer's face. The laugh sounded like that of a little girl, but it didn't have a recorded robotic tone. It was natural, as if the child were real. A second later, I heard it again, and I looked right at the young man thinking maybe he had some device playing the sound to scare me. I asked him how he was doing it, and he told me he wasn't doing anything. He thought I had brought my little sister into the shop because the laugh had come from inside. We both froze in confusion. The OXXO isn't in a residential area with children around, and it's usually very quiet at night. I finished the transaction and sat for a while listening intently for more sound, but the laugh never returned. It stayed with me and made me think for days. The third incident happened months later. Generally, the store was just like any other, but one night, almost at 3 in the morning, I was reading a book behind the counter when I heard a clear exhale. That sound you make when you want to blow out air. I looked up and toward the service window thinking it might be a customer, but no one was there. I tried to go back to reading, but then I glanced straight ahead at the glass front refrigerators where we stored sodas, and I saw breath condensing on the glass as if someone had exhaled on it. At that moment, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I watched for about a minute as that phenomenon repeated, leaving a ghostly condensation on the fridge glass before stopping as if nothing had happened. The fourth event occurred in the bathroom. I was washing my face when I heard a couple of knocks outside. It was almost 6 in the morning. the time my manager usually arrived, so I thought it was him getting there early. I shouted that I was coming out, but got no reply. As you might imagine, when I opened the door, there was no one. The store was empty, and my boss arrived about 10 minutes later. Every few weeks, small things would happen around the shop. A broom would fall, even though I'd leaned it properly against the wall, or a cold gust of wind would mysteriously ruffle my hair. Things that made me nervous but not terrified. I worked there for almost 3 years, aware that something strange took place, and I carried on until the final event arrived. I had already given my notice to the manager and would stop working in just 1 week. I never named that presence nor gave it attention because I'd heard giving them names gave them power over you. So I never overreacted to its attempts to scare me or play pranks. But one early morning, around 4, I went into the storage room at the back to fetch something, and the lights went out behind me. My immediate thought was that a bulb had burned out, but I hadn't heard the switch go down. I reached back, and indeed the switch was down. I flipped it back up, and the light came on. In that moment, I felt a tickling in my stomach, and with a shaking voice, I said out loud, "I'm going to miss you too." I don't really know why I said that, but it felt right. Nothing else happened in the days that followed, and I finished my time there without further incident. I've moved on and returned to that OXXO many times to buy things without feeling anything strange. Still, part of me knows those phenomena probably didn't stop, and I just hope the new employee at that store knows how to handle those little paranormal events with the same patience I had during those 3 years. After all, it just seems to be the spirit of a playful little child. Continuamos. Hello, good evening, community. My name is Reynaldo, and I'm from Mexico City. I worked as a clerk at an OXXO many years ago in a neighborhood known for being quite dangerous. And the story I'm about to tell you has been very hard for me to process, especially because of how strange and traumatic it was. I hope you understand, and don't judge me if it's hard to believe. All I can say is that what I felt that night was very real, and I'm sure it saved my life. It was a regular weekend night, I think in June or July. I was at my post at around 7 or 8 in the evening, and for the first time, I forgot to lock the front door of the OXXO. As I said, the area where I worked was dangerous with a high incidence of robberies and violent crime. The few customers who came at night usually drove, and we served them through the service window. But maybe fatigue or sleepiness or something made me skip checking the doors that night. And one of them stayed open. That mistake would mark my life from then on. When it happened, I was looking at my phone, reading a message my mother had just sent. Suddenly, the sound of breathing froze me in place. I heard an agitated, high voice scream, "Don't leave!" When I looked up, a young man, more like a boy of maybe 15 or 16, was pointing a gun at me that was larger than his hand. It was clear he barely knew how to handle it, and he was so skinny it surprised me he had the strength to hold it. The world slowed down. He wore a hood. His hands trembled, and although I couldn't see his hair or many other details, his pupils were very dilated. He was probably high on something. I raised my hands, and he yelled for me to give him the money from the register. Put all the cigarettes and my phone into a bag he held in his other hand. It was my first time facing something like that, and I froze, as if I hadn't heard anything. Though the neighborhood was dangerous, nobody had ever attempted to rob me personally, and my paralysis seemed to annoy him. He yelled while waving the gun, and suddenly I felt as if he was about to pull the trigger. I covered my head with my arms, and here's where I say something supernatural happened. Because I clearly remember the sensation of someone or something grabbing my wrist and pulling me down toward the floor, and I let it drag me. I let my body fall with the force of the yank while I heard the bangs of the gunfire, and then the silence as the boy ran away. For a moment I thought I was dead. It's strange and hard to describe. Hearing the shots and not knowing what had happened made me assume I was killed. Everything happened very fast. The truth is, I felt the need to stay curled up on the floor, but a voice, I don't know if it was from my subconscious or something real, told me clearly to go lock the door. Like a soldier, I obeyed immediately and ran. I stepped out from behind the counter and locked the door before collapsing to the floor in a panic attack, watching the silhouette of that boy run down the street in front of the OXXO. I sat there for the next 20 minutes recovering and trying to process what had happened. I looked at the place where I had been standing and at the damage the bullets had made in the counter, and my heart raced when I understood that I had nearly lost my life and that a yank, a pull, saved me in a way I couldn't rationally explain. It wasn't an instinct telling me to duck nor a reflex. I literally felt as if someone real had grabbed me firmly by the left wrist and with all their strength yanked me to the ground. They did it so forcefully that for days I had pain in my shoulder, almost like it had been dislocated. But that pain was far better than becoming another statistic of violent crime in our country. I told my mother through tears, and she, crying too, insisted I must have a guardian angel. Fortunately, I no longer work at that shop. I found a better paying job in a much safer place. But no matter where I go, the memory of that night when I nearly lost my life, and when somehow a being, an entity, or who knows what gave me a second chance, still lives with me. Suscribirte y darle like ayuda mucho a este canal. Te agradeceré que presiones el botón de suscribirse. Hello, horror community. My name is Leniska. After listening to so many stories on this channel, I decided it was time to share my own. Something that happened to me about 8 years ago while I was traveling in Bogota. Forgive me if it isn't very long. Honestly, everything happened really fast. Back then, I was traveling with a close group of university friends. We'd come all the way from the Dominican Republic to Colombia for a physics conference. Truth be told, although we were there for academic reasons, we couldn't resist taking advantage of being in another country to enjoy ourselves. On the weekend before heading back to the Dominican Republic, we toured the city and went out partying at night. We got drunk at a nightclub a friend from the conference recommended, and we danced until around 3 in the morning. Only when one of my classmates fell asleep at a table did we realize it was time to go back to the hotel. Fortunately, our hotel was pretty close to the club, so we were able to walk back without much trouble. Once at the hotel, my roommate Emma and I suddenly had a monstrous hunger. I think we hadn't eaten since 6 in the evening, and still drunk, we decided to go to an OXXO on the same street to grab something. We knocked on the door of another friend. I'll call him Jesus. And together the three of us walked and chatted nonsense. We hoped the OXXO would have packaged food or something like that, because honestly, we'd never been to one and had no idea what they sold. When we arrived, the clerk told us she could make hot dogs for us. I don't remember exactly how she called them. Panchos, perros calientes, but we all understood and got excited. I think each of us ordered 2 or 3, and while the attendant prepared them, I wandered through the store. I was lost in my thoughts, scanning which chips to buy, when I felt a heavy stare down the back of my neck and a current running up my spine. It was a very strange sensation, so I turned around and, I'd estimate, about 5 meters away, standing in the corner of the store, I saw a boy staring back at me. The first thing that struck me about him wasn't his angry eyes, his twisted expression, or his clenched fists. I noticed those seconds later. What hit me first was how incredibly pale he was. I don't mean the kind of pale that comes from never going outside or from albinism. I mean a pallor that was almost translucent white. I swear I could almost see through him a little. Then came that coiled anger emanating from him that made me feel deeply uncomfortable. I wanted to call to my friends, but I was mute with fear and I was terrified to take my eyes off him because I thought he might attack. I ended up whispering something like a soft wave while I took a step backwards to put distance between us. Then I heard a deep moan, like a heavy, listless sigh. Suddenly, Jesus called me. I turned to look at Jesus and ask for help, and when I looked back, the boy had vanished. I ran to my friends who were already starting to eat and told them that a very strange boy had been staring at me. The attendant looked at me and asked where he was. When I pointed to the corner where he'd been standing and described him, she fell silent and simply told me that nobody had come into the store all night. That was impossible, so I asked Jesus to help and we checked every aisle. But we found no one. At least until the attendant, who'd been watching us with a face that silently said, "Please don't break anything," politely asked us to stop because she was absolutely sure no one had entered before us on her shift. I was drunk and stubbornly insisted that I had seen what I'd seen, but I had to back down because the fact was undeniable. The young man with the furious stare had disappeared. I asked that we leave as soon as possible, and we ended up eating in the hotel room. I don't know what that thing was, but Jesus and Emma found the story hilarious and began trading their own scary stories. Assuming I was just very drunk and had imagined the whole thing, even I started convincing myself for a few hours that I'd daydreamed. But that night I had vivid nightmares of that boy attacking me, and that feeling of fear and distrust stuck with me for days. Now, after reliving that incident many times, I'm convinced it was completely real. I don't know how or why, but I know I came face to face with a spirit filled with rage, and I was very glad that night to be with my friends and not alone. If Jesus hadn't called me, I don't know how long that stare would have lasted or what the outcome would have been. Continuamos. Hello, community. My name is Fabiana, and the story I'm about to tell you happened several years ago when I was new in the city I live in now. In fact, I was a migrant, literally brand new to the country at that time. Keep in mind, I was about 23 then, and completely alone in the world. I had no friends and I distanced myself from family over various issues that aren't relevant now. I rented a small studio on the outskirts, and making ends meet on a delivery driver's salary was difficult. I had no roommates to share daily expenses, and I hadn't had time to make friends with neighbors. I truly was alone, and that context is important to understand the rest of this story. Near my home, there was an OXXO I used to visit for necessities, usually around the same hours, between 1 and 2 a.m., after I finished work. Every night, the same employee served me, a blonde girl in her 20s like me, whom I'll call Sophia. After a few months of practically daily visits, we became friends, and she would even let me come inside the store, which was normally locked at that hour, so we could have coffee and chat about life. She was my first real friend here, and she still is, and she witnessed what I experienced. Thanks in large part to her, I didn't chalk what I saw up to fever hallucinations. Around mid-December, maybe due to the weather or for some other reason, I got very sick. I had a 39 degrees Celsius fever, chills, no appetite, and I felt terrible. My bones and muscles ached, and standing up was an ordeal. I had nobody to care for me, and I didn't want to bother Sophia, so I tried to take care of myself. Though now I know she would have happily helped. The doctor prescribed rest and fluids, but I was running out of supplies and had to go down to the OXXO. I mustered my courage, took deep breaths, wrapped myself up warmer than I ever had, and went down to the store around midnight. I walked along the dark street and past the OXXO window. This is where things get strange. I waved to Sophia, expecting her to recognize me immediately. All I could see at first was what I thought was her silhouette in profile. I approached the door expecting her to unlock it. Seconds passed, and she didn't take the latch off. I wondered whether she hadn't seen me, or if my hat and jacket made me unrecognizable, so I went back to the window. There, behind the counter, wasn't Sophia but a different girl with a very odd aura. She was dark-skinned, black and curly-haired, maybe in her 30s, and she stood rigid, staring forward without moving a muscle. At that moment, many thoughts ran through my head as I stared at her, and if I recall correctly, she didn't even blink. She was that strange. I tried to speak, pushing past the discomfort. I greeted her and asked for Sophia, but she didn't respond. I thought she was rude, but I tried anyway to ask for what I needed, and she simply didn't react. She was petrified in place, and I felt like I was addressing thin air. I asked again about Sophia, and finally that woman turned very oddly, slowly twisting her neck as if her hinges were rusted, looked at me for a second, and then looked forward again. I regretted it instantly. I assumed Sophia had quit without telling me, and that this strange rude woman was her replacement. But I couldn't waste time thinking about that because I felt worse, and every minute away from my bed took its toll. I remembered another mini market nearby and, hoping it would be open, walked there and managed to buy what I needed. My fever must have gotten worse, and the way back felt endless. I passed the OXXO frontage again about 5 minutes later, and this time Sophia was clearly behind the glass. She didn't hesitate to open the door and let me rest inside. I was in bad shape and she helped me sit down. While that was happening, I heard boxes or something moving in the back of the shop, probably in the storage room, and I asked if it might be her new coworker. But Sophia froze and told me it had just been the two of us in the OXXO. Now, perhaps because of the fever, I had a string of nasty chills run through me. I told her I'd seen another girl behind the counter and described her, but Sophia insisted she'd been alone and had even left the register unattended while she went to the bathroom. Only for a couple of minutes. We both thought maybe someone had slipped into the store, and Sophia decided to check. She took the pepper spray from my keychain and approached the storage room slowly. After inspecting the whole place, she found no one. Neither of us knew what to say. Sophia asked me again what I had seen and, as you might imagine, suggested I'd seen wrong or maybe hallucinated because of my high fever. But community, I was sick, not crazy. I know what I saw. I know I tried to speak to her many times and that she looked back at me. I asked about the noise in the back, and Sophia confessed that when she had gone in earlier, she hadn't seen anything on the floor and had no idea what caused the sound. Needless to say, there were no back exits behind the store, so neither of us could explain what had happened that night. She jokingly offered that I could stay the night in the store, but it was impossible. I couldn't endure another minute without lying down. I went home and Sophia came by my apartment the next morning after her shift to check on me. Nothing else strange happened that night, though I must admit the atmosphere felt a little odd. Years later, we still remember that anecdote. While Sophia worked at that OXXO, she never experienced another supernatural event, but she always felt the place was too quiet, and that made her uncomfortable. She was glad when I visited. If you asked me now what happened, I'd answer without hesitation that I saw a ghost. I don't have proof, but I have a deep feeling of strangeness I've never felt with anything else. I think something inside each of us recognizes when something has no explanation, and that's how I feel about this story. No matter what excuses or explanations I try to come up with, for me that encounter was supernatural.